where he is writing about the mass of humanity who lead lives of quiet desperation. So for all of those who are kind of clinically depressed or who have that kind of documented medical need for the use of psychedelics, there are many more people who lead lives which lack a feeling of significance, which lack some of the kind of basic constituents of the exercise of political agency and autonomy, fundamental self-belief and self-trust, for example. And I really do think that psychedelics can help enhance those kind of proto-political dimensions. Where that then takes you, the macro level, socially speaking, is much more problematic to kind of envisage. But I think, I do sincerely believe we have to accept that the whole political spectrum will become more enlivened in that way.
Hello, I'm Oshan, and welcome to the Musing Mind podcast. Psychedelics have been on my mind a lot lately. I wrote a kind of long-form State of the Psychedelic Renaissance piece for Vox a few months ago, and I've been having all sorts of conversations since, looking at what this moment of psychedelic reintegration into society is doing well, what it's doing poorly, what it might be missing altogether. And today's conversation is with Oliver Davis, who is very much a scholar of precisely these aspects of psychedelics that I find to be both the most interesting and the most neglected from today's discourse around them. Oliver is a professor of French studies and director of graduate studies at the University of Warwick in the UK. He is a co-editor of an ongoing series in the journal Frontiers in Psychology on the psychedelic humanities, which is fascinating. He's at work on a book about the politics of psychedelics, and he's the author of a recent paper on the French artist Henri Michaux and his writings on psychedelics, which spanned many books, which are going to serve as something of a guide for the conversation today. We get into things like what is lost in the potential of psychedelic experience when it's approached exclusively as a therapeutic tool to be used under highly regulated and controlled settings. We talk about Michaux's work, especially his turbulent view on psychedelics and creativity, and kind of threading the needle between science and mysticism when it comes to making sense of these experiences. We talk about psychedelics and politics, which is something that I really like about Oliver's focus, where one of the most important implications of psychedelic experience is not what it can teach us about consciousness or the nature of the universe, though these are fascinating and worthy of study, but how it might help us rethink our social and economic worlds, right? How psychedelic experiences might help foment a more democratic form of politics. On the whole, I think that this kind of emerging field of the psychedelic humanities is super rich and increasingly important as psychedelics continue this march into the mainstream. And Oliver is a wonderful guide through some of the questions that animate that field, right? Through some of the critiques it has of a purely biomedical paradigm, and also through Michaux's work, which is a lost and neglected but really rich map to the psychedelic experience, much more so, I think, as we'll hear, than Aldous Huxley's kind of famous mescaline trip report, The Doors of Perception, for example. If you read Huxley, you might get the idea that psychedelics are just wonderful and incredible and positive. You take your dose and you have a few hours of revelatory ecstasy and insight where you see the universe as it truly is. But Michaux's study is full of turbulence, of discomfort, but also of revelation and insight, and the interplay between uncomfortable disruptions and unusual, elevated insights is, I think, a much more fitting guide than just the revelation alone for individual experience, and also for the coming decades of how society at large is going to metabolize psychedelics. If you enjoy the show, consider leaving a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. You can also become a Patreon supporter. You can give $1, $2, $3 a month, and that stability really helps in producing more episodes. You can find that at patreon.com/OshanJarrow, or just follow links from the podcast page. You can find that at musingmind.org/podcast. And that'll do it. Here's Oliver Davis. So, Oliver Davis, welcome to the podcast, and thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much, Oshan, for the opportunity to talk about some of my work on psychedelics.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of your endeavors is co-editing this series of articles published in the journal Frontiers of Psychology that all kind of revolve this topic of the psychedelic humanities. And first, I'd actually like you to explain what that means, right? What are the psychedelic humanities? And then second, as my kind of underhanded way of weaving in some of your background and biography a little bit, I wonder if you could share how you came to be interested in this particular perspective, right? What was your road to the psychedelic humanities, and what speaks to you in that space?
Sure. Yeah. Two very good questions to start with. So people are beginning to talk about the psychedelic humanities. There have been some really interesting institutional initiatives in this regard. I'm thinking in particular of the founding of the laboratory for the psychedelic humanities by Nick Langlitz at the New School. That's
really near me, right? I've heard about that.
It is. It's a really exciting development. But I mean, the psychedelic humanities, even though we're just beginning to talk about them in those terms, I suppose one could say, ever since historians started working on the history of psychedelics and anthropologists on the use of psychedelics in indigenous cultures, particularly, we've been doing the psychedelic humanities. We've just not been calling them the psychedelic humanities. But they are beginning to coalesce under that heading or label, and I think that's a really important moment, actually, because so much of the research, as you know, on psychedelics in the so-called psychedelic renaissance comes from neuroscience and neuropharmacology, and that's all great. But there is a real need, I think, for the humanities to begin to engage with the implications of this research. How I came to them. So my interest initially was not in psychedelics. I had an interest among many other research interests in psychoactive drugs more broadly. So some of my early research was on particularly on the use of psychoactive drugs by gay men in sexual subcultures and dance club cultures. So I really came to be interested in psychedelics through other kinds of drug research.
Out of curiosity, what were those psychoactive drugs?
Okay, so in chemsex cultures or pharmacosexual cultures, as they're sometimes called, so these will be a combination of drugs, including GHB, GBL, methamphetamine, mephedrone, and others. Yeah, so different kinds of drugs. On the kind of clubbing dance culture side, of course, ketamine, which is now considered a psychedelic, although albeit not a kind of classical psychedelic. Ecstasy, MDMA, and the funny thing is, for me, actually, the interesting thing, working as someone who's kind of been observing these cultures, partly within them, partly from the outside, for a couple of decades, is that people were using some of these drugs that are being discovered for medical therapeutic uses now in dance clubs in the 1990s. So I think that's it's a kind of irony of history that intrigues me.
Yeah. So you came through these kind of really interesting kind of niches of broader psychoactive drugs in the club scene. And then how did you step from there into particularly the psychedelic humanities?
I'd started to hear about some of the research being done, particularly by David Nutt and Robin Carhart-Harris. And I'd started reading some of that work, and that intrigued me. And I think the particular properties of psychedelics lend themselves to investigation by scholars in the humanities in perhaps in a more intensive way than some of the other psychoactive drugs that I've already mentioned.
Yeah, this is, I think, a common story. When that research started coming out, particularly from David Nutt and Carhart Harris, that was extremely intriguing research. I think it had a kind of a gravitational pull. It pulled a lot of folks into this
Yes.
realm. Okay, so the way that I came across your work was this paper you published a few months ago on the French, mid 20th century poet and painter Henri Michaux. And that paper kind of weaves across a couple of topics that I want to touch on today, mainly what psychedelics can offer beyond their biomedical and therapeutic forms, and the political implications and even potentialities that they can stir up. I don't necessarily want to confine the conversation to Michaux. You yourself are at work on a book on the politics of psychedelics that goes well beyond him. But I think he'll be a nice guide kind of as we make our way through the terrain. So let's start with Michaux. One of the literary touchstones that people use as a signpost in making sense of the psychedelic experience, especially early on, was the British author and philosopher Aldous Huxley. He took mescaline, he wrote The Doors of Perception, and that's still referenced to this day. You've argued that Michaux, who wrote a series of books on his mescaline experiences right around the same time as Huxley, actually produced a far kind of richer, more textured and interesting engagement with psychedelics, but for reasons of translation lag times and his being in France where there wasn't as much of a counterculture scene, Huxley became the kind of early literary emblem of psychedelic experiences. So let's turn to Michaux then. Who was he? And what about his writing on mescaline trips strikes you as so interesting, even as to kind of rival or surpass Huxley's?
Sure, yeah. So Michaux was born in Belgium, so he was originally Belgian. He hated Belgium. He moved to Paris in the 1920s. He frequented surrealist milieu. He then traveled very extensively before settling in Paris, where he produced works of literary criticism, works of visual art, and works of literature and poetry. And he's really a kind of he's not so much studied now, actually, for his literary output, but he is a kind of touchstone of kind of high modernism in France. My suggestion is in the paper that you mentioned is really that in a sense his engagement with mescaline is far richer, far more extensive, actually, than Huxley's. Huxley did it first, just
that often means a lot, doesn't it?
It often does. And Michaux was familiar with Huxley's work, but he was also very much anchored in French biomedical research on psychedelics within psychiatry in Paris at the time. So he was a close friend of Jean Delay, whom your listeners might be familiar with, as because Delay is usually remembered as the person who discovered the antipsychotic properties of chlorpromazine. But Delay, as researchers such as Zoe Dubus, whose work is fantastic, have shown, Delay was also very interested in psychedelics too. So Michaux was a social acquaintance of Delay's, and a kind of so they inhabited this kind of shared cultural and intellectual milieu, and they kind of refer to each other in their papers and their books. And I suppose one can sort of see Delay, the doublet or couplet of Delay and Michaux, a bit like the kind of couplet of Humphrey Osmond and Aldous Huxley. Mm. For me, the kind of the interest in Michaux's work on mescaline, and the reasons why it's kind of more significant, I think, than Huxley's, is the variety of its engagement and its transmedial quality. So the inclusion of works of visual art within the book, these kind of mescaline drawings, these reconstructions, these visual reconstructions of the mescaline experience. It's not an easy read. Huxley is more digestible, Michaux's work is much more difficult, I would say. But I think it is a more substantial engagement with psychedelics, and as you say, I mean, I think the reason it hasn't really been sort of taken up is mainly contingent reasons of accident to do with translation or the lack of translation at the right time for it to be. So the kind of the first book, Misérable Miracle, Miserable Miracle, was translated kind of early enough, but it's his kind of most pessimistic appreciation. The later books are much more kind of enthusiastic and much deeper, really, in their embrace of the mescaline experience.
And am I correct in remembering that the first book, Miserable Miracle, was published first, but it took a while then for the second one to be published? Or was a big lag between them?
So Misérable Miracle was published by City Lights, by the San Franciscan countercultural publishing house in English translation in 1963. So it was the original was published in 1956. So it was published in translation in 63. And then the second, L'Infini Turbulent, the Turbulent Infinity, which came out the year after in French in the original in 1957. It didn't appear in English until the mid 1970s. So, after the counterculture, essentially, after the American counterculture.
Well, that makes sense, right? Like if the first book that came out that was around for, the brunt of the American counterculture was not so hot on psychedelics, you can imagine that folks kind of, the energy was high, folks were excited, and here, it could be read as a downer until you get to, the rest of it.
Absolutely. And the funny thing is as well is that there's a second edition of the first book of Misérable Miracle that comes out in 1972 with a sort of a postface which is entitled Addenda, and in it basically Michaux kind of recants the most pessimistic dimensions of that book. The kind of the history of the publishing, the history of the publication of this series of works, I think has meant that he wasn't taken up in the way that more vocal enthusiasts like Huxley were, which is a shame. And I'm trying, in a way, the article is trying to say, well, look, hang on, there is also this work too.
Yeah, I mean, it's I think this is a theme throughout Michaux's work, and we'll get into this when we talk about his view on creativity. It's a longer process where there's kind of a gate, or you have to go uphill at the beginning, but if you hang with the adversity and stay through it, on the other side of that, you get a lot of this richness. But it's kind of like if you come to his work wanting the immediate, interesting payoff, and you want the big kind of rapturous, take on psychedelics, it doesn't hit you right off the bat. You have to kind of work through the adversity, through the disruptions. And we'll track that in his on creativity, because I think it works perfect. But I do wonder, for example, when I think of Huxley's Doors of Perception, one of the images or the ideas that has lingered with me through that was this idea, he writes about the brain as a reducing valve that filters the huge stream of information a brain registers, what Huxley called mind at large, into the measly trickle of what he calls the kind of consciousness that's useful for our survival on the surface of this particular planet. And so this idea, which was then compressed into the reducing valve, which got caught on in a lot of popular media, a lot of books, things like this. I think it's difficult with Michaux because, as you say, it was richer, it was more varied, it was more textured. I don't think you can collapse it onto kind of singular ideas. And also it was transmedial. It was writing, it was painting, it was a lot of different kind of forms at play. But are there kind of themes that you've taken with you, kind of ideas of his that stick out as kind of graspable handles that point to the wider range of the terrain that he charted?
I mean, one of the things to say about, Huxley's idea of the reducing valve comes from Henri Bergson, doesn't it? Which is it's an interesting kind of sort of transatlantic borrowing. And I'd agree. I mean, there is the kind of coefficient of adversity with Michaux's work is much higher than with the really more accessible writing of Huxley. I mean, I think I think it is that kind of sense of the extended process through which Michaux, as a self-experimenting subject, goes. That is one of the most interesting features of the series. So the fact that he starts off with this kind of visceral reaction against the mescaline experience, which, as he continues to experiment, and it's a strange kind of, it's actually a very interesting, I think, personality type, that has a kind of bad experience, and then decides, instead of avoiding the experience,
right,
to repeat it, to practice, in a way, the against that coefficient of adversity. And then, so I mean, I think there are kind of characterological personality features of Michaux that make him a far more engaging experience over the volumes. I think it's that sense of the way in which he moves from a visceral opposition to a kind of quasi-mystical, but still, it's not kind of fully fledged mysticism. It's still in a way kind of physicalist mysticism. Yeah, for me, one of the other things also that's interesting about Michaux's work is, of course, he wasn't the first writer in 20th century France to look at mescaline. So there is the precedent of Alexandre Rouillet in the 1920s. He wasn't a literary writer at all. He was a pharmacist and a kind of entrepreneur who was producing this concoction, pan-peyotil, this concoction made from peyote cacti that he was cultivating in France. But that's a very kind of mystical text, actually, that relates the use of peyote to Central and Southern American indigenous cultural usage. And then there's Antonin Artaud, his book Les Tarahumara, which is all about his trip to Mexico and his experience of peyote, the peyote ritual with the Tarahumara tribes. And so Michaux was writing after those two figures. And so he takes this resolutely different approach, which is to say he's not interested in peyote. He's only interested in synthetic mescaline. And that's the kind of point of departure. And for me, that's a very interesting kind of, I think it sort of expresses something of his sort of oppositional character, to want to relate to the tradition insofar as it existed in France in that way. But yeah, so I think you're starting out from that kind of, that focus on laboratory synthesized mescaline rather than peyote, but then actually moving into a kind of mysticism.
Mm. Yeah, and that's a theme that we'll pick up on. I think he has a really interesting kind of path that he charts through that. But I think maybe the first road to go down with Michaux is his lens on psychedelics and creativity, as well as your interpretation of it, because these actually differ a little bit. Michaux's own experience, as we've kind of touched on, it's not exactly what you might expect from a French poet taking psychedelics at first, right? His initial reaction is to say, quote, mescaline diminishes the imagination. It castrates the image. It is the enemy of poetry, of meditation, and above all, of mystery. Yeah. He dismisses psychedelic imagery as again, quote, a tacky retinal circus, which is a wonderful phrase. So I want to get to how you interpret this and his larger body of work, but let's start with Michaux. How did he view psychedelics and creativity? Did that evolve over time? Was it always a tacky retinal circus, or did he kind of hang with that coefficient of adversity to see an evolution in his views? What did he make of it?
I think that he always regarded. So obviously, when some people get visuals when they take psychedelics, and other people don't, or they don't get as many as others, he obviously did. And I think throughout he considered the visual dimensions, or hallucinations as they're sometimes called, to be a kind of a sort of tacky. A tacky retinal circus. So I don't think he at any point disavowed that view of the visuals. I think he started out imagining that psychedelics, but mescaline, would allow him to be more creative. So they would somehow furnish him with ready-made images, that he could then reproduce visually or in poetry. So in other words, it would kind of be a bit like a sort of, the psychedelic experience would be a bit like a sort of production line. And he would then kind of receive these, these images and represent them. But in fact, he found those images to be extremely disappointing. But what the value of the experience, though, was then that the production line got sort of disassembled. So, as it were, the kind of machinery broke down, and in fact, he was, he's the machinery, really. His mind is the machinery, and it was his observation of the way in which his mind became kind of deranged. He uses the word in French, les dérèglements, which is very reminiscent of the poet Arthur Rimbaud, the idea of the dérèglement of the senses. So this, I think it was the kind of disturbance in his creative process that the psychedelic experience produced. It was by repeatedly practicing with that disturbance and, in a sense, kind of incrementally coming to know it and, in a sense, overcome it, and in a sense, be energized by it. That's where he found the kind of creative value, not in the kind of, not as a sort of source of ready-made images. I mean, literary critics today tend not to think of literature in the way that Michaux did implicitly, as a kind of collection of sort of pretty images, that you just, you admire and you extract. But no. So I think that's he didn't find in the psychedelic experience what he expected to find at all. But he through practicing with it, he found something else that I think was in the end more valuable to him.
Yeah, I mean, I really like the way that you write about this, in that it wasn't precisely that, the content of his writing or the images that he described. It was kind of the site of the creativity at play. It was kind of in grappling with the disruption of the ordinary habits, what came through that. You wrote about this, you mentioned a bit, as a de-automization of his practices. It's kind of at first unwelcome disruption. And a lot of prior research, you touch on this in your piece, on psychedelics and creativity, which was a big theme in the 50s of the research that was ongoing, looked at, as you mentioned, the production of outputs, creative outputs within existing frameworks. And in contrast to that, you wrote that Michaux's work suggests that psychedelics do not always enhance creativity simply by increasing output within existing forms and frameworks. They sometimes first dismantle those forms and frameworks. They clear a space in which the subject can reconfigure the terms of representation, remaking the forms, tools, and techniques of representing. And, this has so many fascinating kind of tangents out into how the therapy works, how just pure recreational kind of exploration works. And one of my kind of favorite stories that Michaux recounts is when he accidentally took a huge dose of mescaline, bigger than he had intended. And he tells us that he became letters and lines, right? He became the very medium that he usually works with. He's usually the writer who creates the letters from above, from his little, vantage point. And he has this experience of the lines going not only through him, but his entire being confined within them. And reflecting on it afterwards, he writes that to have become a line was a catastrophe, but even more, it was a surprise, a prodigy, right? So you almost see this progression in that very line, from catastrophe through the surprise to the kind of prodigal outputs. And I think that encapsulates so much, right? That journey. And it reads to me again like this staying with the adversity rather than getting turned off at first blush gatekeeps these really interesting outcomes.
And I think that's a great line to highlight, Oshan, because he was a stubborn person, Michaux. He was a person of very fixed habits, but he was also capable of responding to new information in a flexible way. And I think that's a great example of where he does that.
Yeah. Okay. So let's take the basis of creativity and let's move towards the question of politics. One of the first things you do on this subject is you define politics maybe a little differently than folks are used to, right? Instead of the macro political categories like liberal and conservative, which is, a topic of research today, people trying to figure out if there's an intrinsic kind of leaning towards psychedelic experience on any of these dimensions. But you invoke this idea of a molecular or micropolitics as more fitting to talk about psychedelics. So what do you mean by micropolitics, and how does that fit in with psychedelics?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the understanding of the micropolitical, it comes out of a tradition of thinking about politics that's quite well established in certain parts of French continental philosophy in particular. One of the philosophers I've done a lot of work on, Jacques Rancière, is a kind of significant figure in this, and has been caught up in what's sometimes called the aesthetic turn in political theory. And that doesn't mean that the politics becomes sort of dissolved into looking at just art and prettiness and so on, nor does it actually mean looking at kind of the aesthetic dimensions of political ritual. I don't know, kind of Nazi insignia or whatever. What it means is it goes back to the idea in ancient Greek philosophy of aesthesis, of a single faculty of sense and perception and judgment. So the idea then is that the way that we see the world, the way that we perceive the world, is kind of prior to whatever kind of developed macro political position we might have. So ways of looking and seeing subjects as political or not, and that could be topics as political or not, or people as political or not. They kind of, as it were, precede and inform and to a certain extent determine the constituted political positions we might then go on to hold. So in other words, there's a kind of layer, a micro-political layer underneath the macro-political choices and positions that we hold to. And so I think this is particularly well adapted to thinking about the politics of psychedelics, because what psychedelics do, whatever else they may do, but one thing they definitely do is they alter modes of perception, forms of perception. And okay, they do it temporarily. Generally speaking, they do it for the duration of the trip. But the very fact of going into that altered state of perception and then coming out of it encourages a kind of reflection on the ways in which we see the world. And so that reflection on ways of seeing that psychedelics tend to produce, for me, that's the kind of micro-political import and significance.
One thing that I find really interesting about the idea of micropolitics is that, at least for me, it was something of a kind of hidden or concealed possibility for a long time, right? For the first, about 17 years of my life. And by this point, I'd read some contemplative literature. I'd been around the spiritual circuit. I'd done some meditation. But if you told me that my modes of perception could be radically different, that they could be altered at a really basic level, I might have agreed intellectually, but I had no idea what that actually meant at a visceral level. And then I took a bunch of mushrooms and, had the experience of that being so, of what we might call that kind of micro-political rupture in my mode of perception. And it made sense in a way that it never could have before, at least I don't think. So I think that micropolitics, in this sense, they aren't obvious because it requires a kind of experiential shift that you can reference. And those shifts aren't programmed into the routines of, say, American life. In other cultures, there have been things like rites of passage rituals that perform some of that function, that tear down those culturally osmosed sense-making machineries that we acquire and give you this radically different vantage point on your own experience. And you come back with that knowledge. But in Western culture, that seems to be something that we're left to find on our own. And I think that this has an interesting link to the more kind of familiar macro political categories, right? Macro politics, Republican, Democrat, and so on, they tend to give the sense of politics as working in a top-down fashion, right? There are those big political parties and organizations, and for most ordinary people, they feel entirely out of touch, right? Out of reach of our own lives. And yet, the decisions that are made at those levels kind of come down to act on us nevertheless. And this idea of micropolitics, to me, it tries to describe the way that those top-down political influences actually rely on bottom-up influence, and not just through the channel of voting, even though that is one, but they also rely on a mass of people who share certain sensibilities, right? Certain arrangements of consciousness, certain modes of perception, certain ways of showing up and being in the world, right? That all those kind of individual qualities sustain macro political categories, but also provide channels by which they can be changed, right? I think the 60s show this pretty well, that you get enough disruption in the ways that people choose to live their lives, the values that they hold dear, and that'll ripple up and cause all sorts of disturbances at the macro political layer. But then kind of marshaling that disruption towards enduringly beneficial ends or new political institutions that can embed those different values into the kind of enduring crust of society. That's a whole other challenge. But you're doing a lot of work on this idea that psychedelics can feed some democratic energy into the bottom-up channels that sustain those larger kind of macro levels. And I don't want to jump too far ahead yet. We'll get more specifically into that question. I just wanted to point that out because I love the way that you make that connection.
Thank you.
But I think to start, I want to look at this idea that you came up with of the redundancy thesis, right? This idea it's so relevant to the ongoing efforts to devise legal modes of access to psychedelics, that kind of go beyond clinical trials, especially now as Oregon's adult use model, it's already underway. Colorado's close behind. California has a bill that looks like it might pass. And this idea that you have of the redundancy thesis is a really good way, I think, into that discussion of what we lose if these models remain too tightly controlled, too regulated and constrained in the absence of other modes of access as well. So walk us through this. What is the idea of the redundancy thesis?
Right. Yeah. So the redundancy thesis, there's a lot of anxiety now about what Nick Langlet's called rightist psychedelia. And he's not the only person who's concerned about it. There's a lot of anxiety about the way in which groups like QAnon, some members of those groups are kind of interested in psychedelics. This idea that psychedelics might somehow be leading to a kind of authoritarian, fascist, right-wing future. So, in other words, they're kind of the long-standing historical association with the left, with the counterculture, is just a kind of accident, a contingency. I am also kind of concerned by rightist psychedelia. I'm not dismissing the concern, but what I mean by the redundancy thesis is that I think that in cultures that are already plural or pluralist, as the US today or other developed nations in particular, so not indigenous cultures, let's say, in cultures that are already plural, if you add psychedelics into the mix, you produce all sorts of unpredictable effects. So in an indigenous cultural setting, psychedelics are often used to kind of reinforce cultural norms. There's a great line about in Peter First, the anthropologist Peter First's work on the Huichol, where he says he reports an experience with peyote, and the user says, "Oh, it is as my fathers taught me." So you have what is essentially kind of already a culture that is not especially kind of plural, is already quite homogenous, using psychedelics to, in a sense, reproduce its norms and values. In a culture that is a pluralist culture, if you introduce psychedelics, you could expect to see all sorts of different wild and uncontrollable effects. So the redundancy thesis is the idea that you would need to control all of the aspects of the setting in which the psychedelics were being taken so minutely for them to do the work of reproducing the culture. So because psychedelics amplify features of the in the setting in a quite remarkable way, that actually they'd be redundant. So if you already had complete control over the setting, you wouldn't need psychedelics to reproduce your culture. So in that sense, they would be redundant. They would be redundant.
I see. So in many ways, this kind of gives us a little. It might unwind the anxiety a little bit about the kind of use of psychedelics among different groups. But I think it's really interesting if we hang with the example of psychedelic therapy, for example. On one hand, I don't want to undersell, even in a world where the only way, I'll take the US because that's what I know the best. If in the US, the only way anyone could legally do psychedelics was in the kinds of environments that are currently being sculpted by the kind of biomedical therapeutic perspective, there could still be a lot of good, right? There's a lot of kind of treatment available here for very prevalent mental illnesses. On the other hand, there is a lot of effort and care going into creating these environments in a way that can stabilize the psychedelic experience into, as you've written, a predictable, reliable process, right? We want to quantify and optimize and package these experiences in ways that are replicable and that can generalize across people and contexts. That just fits better with how we do risk assessment and across various institutions, is how the NIH wants to fund research. And, of course, psychedelics, on one hand, they seem almost constitutionally opposed to herding them into predictable tracks. But if you control the setting to such a degree that you achieve that level of predictability, the way I read this thesis is that something is lost, right? That it almost formalizes kind of the paradox of trying to create regulated environments for predictable trips, right? You wrote that for psychedelics to function reliably, that would require their set and setting to already be controlled so comprehensively as to make the political use of psychedelics redundant. If a regime already had control of its subjects' mindsets and environment to such an extent, there would simply be no need to call on the amplificatory effects of psychedelics. And so the question through all this I want to kind of pose to you is how you think about, maybe not in the context of QAnon and right of psychedelia, but in the context of, let's say, the environments that are being reproduced through the therapeutic paradigm, where we go, you're indoors, generally no windows, you have a blindfold on, you listen to music, there's a therapist or two in the room with you. This serves, a function that is very important for many people, right? You kind of mitigate a lot of harms, you mitigate, a lot of anxiety people have. You're with folks who know the terrain, you're in a kind of medical environment that if anything goes wrong, they can tend to you. I think it's easy to cling on to the safety that provides and kind of latch onto that model. But I'm curious what you think we might lose if the only game in town is that mode of access.
I think we would be experiencing a very narrow portion of the possible political spectrum of psychedelic experience. Yeah, I mean, you're quite right. So the whole issue of how to kind of stabilize psychedelics, goes right back to Al Hubbard, creating the Hubbard room with the cozy cushions to kind of get away from the sort of the clinical environment that seemed to cause so many bad trips early on. But it's fascinating to think about what kinds of political subjects are being crafted through this particular way of deploying psychedelics in this context. This medical therapeutic context. I mean, it is. So I approached this partly through the work of Michel Foucault when he was thinking about the way in which the sort of spiritual exercises of the Jesuits and other forms of kind of earlier Christian experience, the way in which they shaped modern Western subjects. And I'm just thinking that in a way, this experience where we're going to say, well, okay, we're going to cure ourselves by sitting in this room, probably putting on eye shades, maybe listening to some music, have someone sit alongside us, but we're going to regulate it to to a high degree. And I mean, you're quite right. There's a whole secondary market in the kind of regulation and accreditation of psychedelic therapists that's really booming at the moment.
Training guides, right? Yeah,
absolutely. Certification, credentialization. Yeah, all of this is really booming. I think it's really interesting to think about the type of subjectivity that is being forged in these medical therapeutic contexts. And in a way, what we're doing politically when we are exposing people to this kind of psychedelic therapy in this type of context is reproducing and consolidating some of the kind of dominant norms of our society. So individualization, appropriate distance, the encounter cannot be sexual, even if the person experiencing it would like it to be, which strikes me as odd, actually. So in a way, what we're doing in that particular way of deploying psychedelics is consolidating norms that already exist in our society. So norms of individual identity, detachment from others, a kind of, if you like, a kind of semi-autistic subjectivity in which people are juxtaposed one with the other, but kind of don't interact or engage in some of the more intense ways that actually psychedelics can allow one to engage. So yes, I would say it's a very narrow kind of sample of the possible wider spectrum of political psychedelic experience that we are calling on in that particular type of medical therapeutic use.
I really like the way that you critique, or at least raise questions around the imperative of having a guide in any legal model of using psychedelics. Right? There are obvious reasons that having a guide provides a lot of value. It helps to manage a lot of the anxiety people might have, especially if it's their first time, or if they just want someone who is trained to help them through anything difficult that may arise. That's incredibly important to offer. But again, if that's the only game in town, I think you do a nice job of pointing out some of the risks. You write, the way in which these major orientations of psychedelic guiding and tripping converge to inform psychedelic experience also shapes political sensibilities, or, and perhaps this is the more usual outcome of current practice, apolitical psychedelic sensibilities. In other words, to a large extent, the way in which we are generally choosing to trip is reflecting and consolidating our society by shaping sensibilities which fit within it. An individualized, risk-averse, securitarian society in which adults require constant guidance by competent authorities and refrain from unduly intimate contact of body and mind, who focus inwards on remedying their problems rather than correcting the course of the world. And I want to be clear, I don't think we should ditch the guided therapeutic model. I think it has tremendous value. It's also a great way kind of to Trojan horse things back in. But I think there are real concerns around what we might lose, or even the social ramifications of that being the singular focus, the only way that psychedelics are legitimized. And, one of the examples that I've been thinking a lot about around, if not in a therapeutically guided individual session, how else might psychedelics be used in a way that doesn't have these same pitfalls? The obvious answer is to look at indigenous cultures where you have often, communities of practice and social and ceremonial use. But even in our own history, there's a fun example with Tim Leary back from the 50s in Harvard. And for listeners, Tim Leary being the Harvard psychiatrist who eventually became the high priest of LSD for the counterculture. But before he got too wild, he had this idea for a graduate seminar at Harvard where at the beginning of every week on Monday, they would choose a social issue, right? Maybe it was the war, poverty, inequality, civil rights. And then they would all take psychedelics together. They would trip with the intention of considering the issue that they'd selected. And then for the rest of the week, Tuesday through Friday, they would just debrief, right? They would unpack any insights they had. They'd compare and contrast with the existing literature and discourse on the issue. And they'd see if they hit upon any, novel approaches or solutions that seem worthwhile to expand on. And, on its face today, we might struggle to imagine universities being able to allow the administration of psychedelics to students, or professors and students tripping together. There's a whole bunch of hurdles here, but it's not inconceivable. And I do think that it hints at a really interesting way of harnessing that creative value of psychedelics that we talked about, of rupturing the settled habits of mind and thought that naturally kind of concretize over time, and opening up the production of knowledge to novel and unusual possibilities, right? You can imagine psychedelics as these agents of making sure that whatever the common sense around a topic is, that it doesn't get too overpowering, right? That psychedelics can kind of help people explore ideas outside the boundaries of common sense. And if we have mechanisms that then help us critically reflect on those ideas, because psychedelics can produce spectacularly bad ideas and false insights. There's a whole bunch of research on false insights in psychedelics that's really interesting nowadays. But if you have something like 4 days of a grad seminar, considering them soberly and placing them kind of in comparison to the existing literature, you might find some really good ones. It's kind of like sifting through all that sediment in a river, looking for those little spots of gold.
I couldn't agree more, and I think I regret greatly that, kind of institutionally speaking, that kind of experiment is not possible at the moment. And I wonder when it will be, because I think actually we started off by talking about the psychedelic humanities, and yeah, of course we can reflect together about psychedelics in an academic institutional context, but actually that kind of experiment that Tim Leary was doing, that in a way is the future of the psychedelic humanities. We just need the kind of institutional regulatory frameworks to allow it, or it's not going to happen in institutions. It'll happen in autonomous collectives, and it'll happen in other spaces. But I think it would be a shame if institutions couldn't embrace psychedelics in that kind of way, because that is actually where some of their most exciting kind of political potential lies.
I'm also really happy that you brought up the example with the huichol in Mexico, where they would take peyote, come back and say, it is exactly as my father's told me. Just kind of contrasting that with how psychedelic experience in the West has been coded, right? Trying to imagine a young person in the US or the UK going on a big psychedelic trip and afterwards saying, yes, things are exactly as I was told. This all makes sense. The image of psychedelics we have is usually antagonistic to the existing structures of society, to the present cultural ecosystem that we're all enmeshed in. And sometimes I think that makes it tempting to think that psychedelics are inherently or intrinsically antagonistic to existing institutions. But when you do this kind of cross-cultural comparison, you see that isn't the case, right? That whether psychedelic experience kind of affirms or grates against the constructs of their world can vary depending on the set and setting of the trip, or in this case, of the cultural setting. So one question that I get from this is to wonder, what would it take, right? How would the US or the UK or any similar Western society, how would things have to change such that when young people go on big trips and come back, they would feel that sense of affirmation with the culture and society that they return to, that they wouldn't get a sense of discord, but of communion, right? What are the necessary shifts so that psychedelic experience harmonizes with American institutions rather than struggles against them? But on the other hand, and this is something that you write about, I don't know if it'll ever be that easy, right? Especially within a society as large and theoretically pluralistic as the US, or the shared set of norms and sensibilities that cut across Western society on the whole, compared to the huichol, for example. We don't have as much homogeneity. So this leads us into your ideas on radical democracy at the micro-political level. Should we think about kind of one good path for psychedelics being where the experience can be brought into harmony with existing structures? Or is their value really as a kind of disruptive democratic ferment where, in societies as pluralistic and diverse as ours, the real value is in energizing people to not just go along with however their parents told them things are, right? Do we want the harmony or do we want the discord?
I think as a radical Democrat, we want the discord. We want the discord, and we want the intensity of the feeling as well. And if we really believe in radical democracy, we have to want that across the political spectrum, which is difficult. I mean, for me, one of the thinkers that I've been trying to use in the book, that I'm sort of in the middle of at the moment on the politics of psychedelics is Thoreau, actually, and Thoreau's Walden in particular, but thinking about where he is writing about the mass of humanity who lead lives of quiet desperation. So for all of those who are kind of clinically depressed or who have that kind of documented medical need for the use of psychedelics, there are many more people who lead lives which lack a feeling of significance, which lack some of the kind of basic constituents of the exercise of political agency and autonomy, fundamental self-belief and self-trust, for example. And I really do think that psychedelics can help enhance those kind of proto-political dimensions. Where that then takes you, the macro level, socially speaking, is much more problematic to kind of envisage. But I think, I mean, I do sincerely believe we have to accept that the whole political spectrum will become more enlivened in that way.
Yeah, I mean, the idea of enlivened politics, is, I think, in many ways antithetical to a lot of people's experience of it today, right? I was listening to the philosopher Danielle Allen talk about this recently, where one of the problems with today's politics is that a ton of people are too busy, with just keeping afloat in their own lives, or too exhausted from the sustained stress of insecure economic positions to ever consider doing something like showing up to a town hall meeting and participating in their political institutions where they have a voice. So you wind up with a situation like today where, in theory, anyone and everyone can participate, but in practice, what you get, for example, like at that town hall meeting, is it's dominated by one particular band of interests, right? Property owners generally, who are already wealthy, who support and voice, their support for policies that protect their interests. And you don't have like the renters showing up who would benefit from more housing and development that would lower rents, for example. And that problem reaches across the board, right? The people with the most resources have the most capacity to engage and shape politics today. So there's that problem. But what I hear you talking about is something almost like an energy parameter, which has a direct correlate in psychedelics, right? Where one thing they do is dial up the entropy of brain activity. Even in today's political landscape, do you see integrating legal psychedelic access for all as something that might dial up the energy people have to participate in politics?
I think that's a great way of putting it and of seeing it. I mean, because what one can understand non-participation in lots of ways. One can say, oh, okay, well, if someone's working 3 jobs and has children to look after, then of course they have no time to take part in town hall meetings and so on. But I think I think in a way that's a kind of, those kinds of sociological explanations are not as persuasive as thinking about, okay, but why is there a lack of energy or self-belief or a sense of the possibility of making one's voice heard or making a difference in a conversation? How can we address that? And I think energy is a very interesting way of understanding that. Yeah, and I think, yes, absolutely. So psychedelics used in a way that sort of exceeds the medical therapeutic paradigm, that quite kind of narrow kind of segment of the wide spectrum, can indeed address this sort of lack of energy or lack of self-belief, or can address that kind of quiet desperation that Thoreau talks about.
Well, so it's interesting then. Yeah, I actually think entropy is a really nice metaphor. This is something I've been reporting a lot on recently. Entropy being effectively a measure of the disorder or the randomness of neural activity, which kind of goes way up in psychedelic states. And so this is thought to, it unsettles habits. There's a whole kind of predictive processing thing where the brain kind of grows less confident in prediction in its own assumptions and predictions, which kind of allows a wider space to entertain, things within the realm of conscious experience that usually you wouldn't because they were ruled out by all these assumptions you've had. But it's interesting to kind of stretch that same kind of explanation to the social level and to think about psychedelics tuning up, the lever of entropy in terms of I like how you write this about our self-belief, our own kind of participation in society, the energy levels ratcheting up just a little bit, maybe tuning up a little more disorder, a little more kind of democratic ferment, which I think you're right. We could draw this line then to kind of more enlivened participation in our lives, whatever that means. Maybe that's political participation. Maybe it's just how I move through my life every day. But it's still, I think, just as important, if not more important. I like that way of thinking about it.
Absolutely, and I think and it might take the form, for example, of saying, well, okay, actually, this town hall meeting is actually not political at all, and I'm not going to go to the town hall meeting because actually this meeting is just a kind of way of apportioning small amounts of distributing small amounts of finance or making kind of small decisions. I'm going to do some kind of more radical protest or intervention. So it might involve a kind of disaffection, a disengagement from some of those kinds of structures of that we think of as political that actually might in fact not be political in a more radical sense.
Well, this is a lot of, I guess, what we saw in the 50s and 60s, right? The kind of the psychedelic experience, I think it was very engaged with the political questions, but it wasn't like all the hippies were going to town hall meetings, it was turn on, tune in, drop out. The modes of life, the ways in which they were living, the kind of things they did with their time were kind of the manifestations of this kind of, reinvigorated sense of politics, I would say.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, obviously, opposition to the Vietnam War was a kind of big macro political cause, but in a sense, that was just part of a kind of opposition to a society in which people, as kind of Marcuse theorized, people were being kind of prepared to be used for their kind of economic value. So it was a rejection of that whole kind of way of living through a form of kind of radical inactivity, in a way, a kind of aesthetic detachment from all of those forms of purposive activity.
Yeah. Do you think it's really interesting that you're thinking with Thoreau here? Do you think Thoreau would have approved of the use of psychedelics? Did he? I don't know if I've ever read any of this on him.
That's a really fascinating question. I think. I mean, he does allude actually at one point in Walden to indigenous to Native American cultures, to the practice of every spring of kind of sweeping out the huts and kind of burning everything and taking what he calls medicine. So medicine there would be peyote. So there is a kind of allusion to that practice, and he seems very approving of that kind of periodic kind of communal cleansing. So yes, I think on the basis of that very small kind of textual moment, I'd say yes, he'd be an enthusiast. I mean, the book that I'm halfway through is kind of tending is towards a kind of account which will look at the idea of rebirth or renaissance as Thoreau imagines it in Walden, as something that we might use psychedelics to produce or inform or enable.
Well, this is something we see a lot. This is, this notion of rebirth is a very common kind of thematic pair with psychedelic experience, given what I think is kind of the blunt language of ego death, but more broadly, this notion of kind of a progressive or kind of variable dissolutions of what we experience as our own selves. Kind of the more you change this phenomenon, this experience, whatever you want to call it, this kind of integrated experience of I, the notion of rebirth becomes a very kind of visceral thing that folks can play with in these contexts. It seems pretty clearly a very fitting way to think about it, doesn't it?
I think so, and the idea of the brain being returned to a much more plastic sort of learning state. Yeah, so a kind of rebirth of the brain, or the brain's kind of capacity for freer play, Yeah, no, these are all absolutely kind of important dimensions as you're suggesting, and in the kind of neuroscientific literature. And I think what's interesting is to think then about what follows from that socially and politically.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, this is the question I keep thinking about. Is so much of what I think defined the kind of American first go around with psychedelics, or the Western world at large, was the ways in which it really began to bleed out into social and political life. And I think during the psychedelic renaissance here in the Western biomedical world, we haven't seen that yet, because whatever renaissance there has been, it has all occurred within like clinically controlled trials. Environments that are very heavily regulated, and there's still the underground, and there's still some decriminalization efforts, but by and large. And so the question I'm really interested in is over the next decade or two, and I think this is what you're charting out a bit, is as psychedelics kind of go beyond only being accessible in these clinical models, what is that kind of new kind of collision with social and political life going to look like? Because I don't imagine it's going to be inconsequential, but I don't know what direction that'll take. How do you think about kind of the next decade or two to come as psychedelics begin? I guess this is the whole notion of the psychedelic humanities, right? But how do you see this collision taking place?
It's very difficult to know actually what's going to happen when, if you like, psychedelics become mainstream. So at the moment, because of the war on drugs, because of prohibition, we have only the examples really of people taking psychedelics at kind of extremes of society, if you like, because the vast majority of people, if they're told by the medical establishment, if they're told by the police, if they're told by politicians, that these substances are, dangerous, they'll make you jump out of windows, and all of this stuff that, was pumped into the society by Nixon and his acolytes, when they sort of set up the war on drugs. Most people, they're not gonna then say, oh yeah, well maybe I'll try them anyway. So what we have at the moment is we have a situation where you've got small numbers of people who've been involved in clinical trials. You've got people who use them outside of legal frameworks, or who are privileged enough to exist, to live in one of the very few places in which one can use them legally. Mm-hmm. But we don't have a kind of evidence base, a current evidence base anyway, of what will happen when the mainstream really embraces psychedelics, as I think they will over the next 10 or 20 years. So in a way, it's a very exciting moment to be thinking about those sorts of implications.
I absolutely agree. And one of the potential implications that I'm really excited and curious about is how more widespread psychedelic experience could reinvigorate conversations around, metaphysics and ontology and our shared understanding of just what sort of universe it is that we're floating in here. Because already, without psychedelics, there's been this move in some corners of philosophy to devise a scientifically informed understanding of the cosmos, but that revives a sense of enchantment or mystery, or even, unknown and potentially unknowable aspects of the world. And you write about how Michaux is kind of one guide through this ongoing effort. You say that rather than the sobering prospect of a merely natural philosophy of psychedelics, Michaux's work suggests that a more promising paradigm, which better captures the force of psychedelic experience, might be mystical naturalism. And I like that phrase a lot. It reminds me of one from the philosopher and something of a mystic Simone Weil, who spoke of enchanted materialism, which I think has a similar flavor, right? That scientific methodology can and should help us come to know the world in a really empirical, testable way, but that doing so doesn't collapse or dispel this sense of mystery and unknowability and all that remains hidden from us, even, for example, in something like the structure of matter itself. So I'm curious how you read Michaux here. How does he guide us through this idea of mystical naturalism, and how does that differ from a kind of plain and simple, reductive, scientific understanding of psychedelics?
I see it as a kind of intermediate position between a kind of hard scientistic naturalism, if you like, on the one hand, and on the other, at the other extreme position, which says, okay, well, psychedelics, they prove that panpsychism is correct, and that that the universe is inhabited only by kind of minded entities of various kinds. Now, with all due respect to those who believe that second position, I think it's quite outlandish, actually. But I think it's quite a distraction from thinking about the political and social ramifications of psychedelics. So I think Michaux's middle course is a very attractive kind of compromise between those two extremes, which enables us to then move on and think about what I think are the more interesting questions around politics and society. So not to get caught up in these, for me, I think these absurd discussions, are DMT entities real, or, how are we going to map psychedelic inner space? I think these discussions are just distractions from thinking about what happens politically and socially when we see more and more people taking psychedelics.
So what do you see, putting a pin on the moment, because I think I have the same sensibility as you, is that my interest leans in the political and social ramifications, but I'm curious. So then for Michaux, I guess my question would be, what is the mystical aspect of his, like what separates his view from a very scientific reading of, because he was, as you mentioned, he would only take kind of lab grade synthetically produced mescaline. He was not interested in indigenous cultures and these kinds of things. So it seems to me possible to read him pretty scientifically. So what kind of elevates him, or what were the kind of ideas maybe that move beyond that for him?
Well, there's this phrase which occurs in the second book in the series, L'Infini Turbulent, where he says, and it's in block capitals, to indicate the emphasis he places on it. I have seen the thousands of gods.
Oh, I love that line. Yeah.
So, and this is not, this is a report of mystical experience, of a kind of a religious mystical revelation. To me, one of the most interesting commentaries on that is by the literary critic Maurice Blanchot, who says, it's interesting, this comment, of Michaux. He says he's seen the thousands of gods, but, even if we like Michaux and we're admiring readers of his work, we don't stop what we're doing and gather round and say, wow, he's seen the thousands of gods, what follows from this. We just take it. We take it as a kind of personal experience of a kind of revelation, but we don't cash it out into metaphysical or ontological consequences.
Yeah, I mean, the kind of classic line is that talking about your psychedelic experiences is very much like talking about your dreams.
Yes.
They carry this energy and this fascination to you and to generally nobody else ever. And but it's interesting, right? Because on one hand, how do we respond to that fact, right? Do we then simply discard these experiences as we learn that other folks are not interested in them? And especially when these experiences have to do with this kind of revelatory aspect, do we hold out kind of space that this is nevertheless important and worthwhile? And kind of how do we balance that with, for example, as we move to political implications? This is something that I think Michaux does well, and I think a lot of my favorite writers on psychedelics today do, is navigating this line between, as you say, not getting too caught up in the experiences themselves. And while I think it's an extremely fun thing to do, it's a nice hobby. And I also think it's an important line of research to ask all the questions we can, like, all right, there are entities, what's going on here? But the way that you can balance the fascination that arises with this kind of revelatory aspect with the kind of, all right, we have work to do. We have politics that need some work. We still have all kinds of poverty. We have all these mental, and so on and so forth. Navigating that balance, I think, is really tricky. And I'm also very excited to see how we continue to do that as these kind of experiences potentially reach wider scales or ratios of the population. We'll see. It's a tough balance.
It is. And I mean, for me, it's the questions around, the reality or otherwise of DMT entities or whatever. They're not. I think they are a bit of a distraction, but I don't think they're futile. But what I do think is that, the way through this is not to say to people, after they've had their trip or their kind of supervised medical experience of psychedelics, is not to say, oh yes, well, there's precedent in the history of philosophy for what you've experienced, so it's okay. I think that's quite it's quite a patronizing response. I think actually a bit rather as for Freud, who obviously found other people's dreams endlessly fascinating, is to say, okay, this is the mind. These are the uncharted, antipodes, the territories of the mind that we just don't experience, we don't know about. We have to start thinking about them and encountering them. But we mustn't allow ourselves to kind of spin off into some kind of, regressive kind of neo-indigenous kind of folklore, which I think that there's a kind of real danger of that in a lot of the discussions in the psychedelic community.
Having traversed a lot of terrain so far, what I want to return to an idea kind of from a higher level, looking at this kind of space beyond the therapeutic role of psychedelics, the question being, if they are not best understood, merely as new therapeutic drugs, what are they and how do we think about them? And to kind of approach this question, you drew on the German philosopher Peter Sloterdijk, who I love. And, he describes psychedelics as anthropotechnics, which I found a really handy concept. So I wanted to ask you if you could unpack that, what that means and how that maybe departs or expands on the therapeutic vision.
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. The idea of anthropotechnics in Sloterdijk. So an anthropotechnics is simply a technique of human self-enhancement. And so for Sloterdijk, meditation would be an example of anthropotechnics. Going to the gym would be an example of anthropotechnics, actually, for Sloterdijk, or the beauty salon as well. He's quite kind of liberal or Catholic, if you like, in his understanding of what self-enhancing anthropotechnics are. But for me, the usefulness of the concept, or that way of seeing psychedelics, is that you can then say, okay, well, the drug, the substance is, okay, that is one element in the anthropotechnical ensemble, which you then associate with or you combine with other elements. So those other elements would include your mindset, the setting you're in, but they might also include a set of political problems of the type that you were referring to in Tim Leary's classes. So that way of seeing psychedelics as anthropotechnics, ways of improving on the human, actually enhancing what it means to be human, but also as necessarily combined with other practices, other cultural objects, including books and works of literature as well. Because for Sloterdijk, in the history, as you, I'm sure you know, in the humanities as a kind of discipline, going back to the 19th century, has to do with kind of the civilization, the education, the civilizing education of the human species through books. And books are the anthropotechnical objects par excellence of the humanities in their kind of classical form. And so then thinking about the psychedelic humanities, obviously psychedelics are going to be involved as anthropotechnics, but they're not only going to be psychedelics. It's going to be psychedelics with other anthropotechnical elements. So
there was someone you pointed to who thought that psychedelics would just full on replace books, right? It might have been Leary.
Yeah, no, Leary did. There's a huge corpus of writings, and one can pick and choose within Leary. No, he said, no, students will come home from university, and their parents, instead of asking them what books have you read, they'll ask their children, which drugs have you taken?
Right.
I mean, I think it was a kind of quip, actually, but no, he did say that.
Yeah. Wow. Well, I think for me, that's a really nice place to kind of draw things down. But I do wonder, before we do that, for you, was anything else on this terrain lingering on your mind? Anything you wanted to throw into the mix?
I am trying to think about mysticism.
Oh boy, this is good.
I'm trying to think about mysticism at the moment. So this is, I'm sort of halfway through this book, and I'm thinking at the moment about the type of mysticism, particularly of Christian mysticism, that Huxley takes up in The Doors of Perception, and then in a way then kind of informs the psychedelic humanities. And it seems to me is a very kind of cerebral type of mysticism. And I'm trying to think of other ways of thinking about the Christian mystical tradition and other mystical traditions as well. So I'm using a lot of the work of Julia Kristeva. She has a wonderful book on Saint Teresa of Avila, entitled Thérèse Mon Amour. So at the moment I'm trying to use that. So Teresa of Avila's form of mysticism is much more kind of embodied and sensual, and I think actually that can help to offset some of the kind of mentalistic, neurological, cerebral skew that psychedelics have at the moment in the way that we're thinking about them. So that's I'll just throw that in. I don't really have any conclusions, but that's what I'm trying to think about at the moment.
Well, that's really interesting. Let me ask you this then. This will be fun. There's a perspective emerging that a lot of folks around me are increasingly kind of excited by, and I think for good reason. But I also think it's early enough that there hasn't been a great critique yet, and I think we need one. So let me try to articulate this perspective on. It's a very kind of scientifically grounded explanation of what, maybe not exactly what mysticism is, but what spiritual experience is and what's going on in these like really maybe not always high dose, but these really kind of expansive experiences folks are having. And the explanation goes something like this. It is, you kind of begin with the context of predictive processing. So the human mind is a prediction machine that has an internally generated model of the world, which aids its kind of survival efforts. We have two streams of information, top down from the brain, which are the generated predictions, and bottom up, which is raw sense data. And generally what we're experiencing is the brain's model, unless there's a prediction error, so on and so forth. So the general idea is that this predictive mind is built on a hierarchy of priors, of assumptions. And these assumptions, as I mentioned before, kind of give shape to what can even enter into the realm of conscious experience. And so one of the leading, explanations of kind of what's going on in the psychology, but off the work of like Robin Carhart Harris, it's the rebus model, the notion that the brain downweights its precision. It grows less confident in those predictions, widens the space of experience, it admits experiences that are usually excluded. And this kind of, this has a bit of explanatory power. Now, in terms of what spiritual experience is or what mystical experience is, the story goes something like, as you unravel the kind of predictive underpinnings of the mind so thoroughly that the mind is no longer engaging in predictions at all, you reach something, you can call it the ground of awareness, you can call it pure consciousness. This is a lot of literature in the meditation space on this. And that effectively what spiritual experience is just what consciousness is like when you have switched off the kind of predictive processes, right? So this is a very mechanistic description of what's going on. What I'm curious, and then, then there's the kind of inverse process of from the ground of awareness, from pure experience, you then have the predictive mind slowly reconstitute itself. And as you bear witness to that process, you have this agency to kind of fiddle with those priors and change them around a little bit. So maybe you had this kind of maladaptive habit because someone made fun of you when you were young, and that's prevented you from sharing your opinion. And now you can realize that and unravel its hold on your ordinary psychology a little bit, things like this. The question I want to ask is there a wider reading of mysticism as it pertains to psychedelic experience that you can draw on that kind of goes beyond just saying, the mind has deconstructed itself and that kind of admits unusual experience, if that makes any sense?
It does, absolutely. But, the mind is all very well, but what about the body? What about the body? What about embodied mysticism? And so I'm thinking of Saint Teresa having her mystical visions, these convulsions, these sort of very corporeal, orgasmic, ecstatic experiences. And that is a very different kind of experience from that that sort of cerebral, brain focused account. I mean, I think I think that model is a very compelling account of what goes on in psychedelic experiences in the brain. But it is interesting, isn't it, that in the medical therapeutic context, we are people are static, pretty much static, and reclining. Generally, the body is not in contemporary psychotherapeutic use of psychedelics. We're not engaging the whole body in the experience. Quite the contrary. So I think, obviously there was pre-prohibition therapeutic use. There was that kind of experimentation. Some of it really quite radical and quite disturbing by some by some lights. But so I'm thinking, So what happens when the kind of the body, the sensing and sexual body is involved in that kind of mystical experience, when it's not just a cerebral, a static thing.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful place to kind of direct how to respond and how to think about building on this idea. Because I feel the same way. I think at its core, it's a very compelling account. It makes a lot of sense. But this notion of kind of encountering, embodied cognition, embodied experience could help expand it. Well, wow. Oliver, thank you so much. This was wonderful. And if folks, myself included, I'm asking this for me, but maybe some listeners will feel the same. If folks want to engage with this kind of emerging field of the psychedelic humanities, are there any particular books or organizations or resources? Where would you point folks to kind of get involved and kind of get their bearings in that?
The new laboratory for the psychedelic humanities at the New School would be a great place to start. They are running some really exciting series of events, both in-person events and online. So that would be a great place to start, I think.
That's wonderful, because it's very close to me.
That's convenient.
Great. Well, hey, listen, thank you so much. This has been really wonderful. It was a pleasure to have the opportunity to engage with your work. And I think it was a really great basis to begin thinking about and watch what happens next. I think it's going to be an exciting decade or two, to say the least.
Thank you so much, Oshan, for your great questions and for our conversation today.
All right. If you made it this far, I hope you enjoyed. You can find links to Oliver's work, resources we mentioned, or a transcript of the conversation on the episode page, which you'll find at musingmind.org/podcast and clicking on Oliver Davis. As always, you can reach me at oshanjarrow@gmail.com if you have comments, ideas for someone else I should have on the show. If you enjoyed the episode, please consider sharing it on social media, even though that's something of a crumbling hellscape these days. And that's it. Hope everyone is well, and I'll talk to you next time.